We read this hadith last week, but there's a lot to discuss about it. So, an al-Mu'mineen, Abdullah Aisha radiyallahu anha, from the mother of the believers, Abdullah Aisha radiyallahu anha, mother Aisha radiyallahu anha, قالت, she said, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, من أحدث في أمرنا هذا, whoever institutes في أمرنا هذا, in this matter of ours, um, referring to Islam, ما ليس منه, what is not from it, فهو رد, then it is rejected. In another narration, in the narration of Muslim, من عمل عملا ليس عليه أمرنا, whoever does an action that is not based on what our matter is upon, meaning what Islam is upon, فهو رد, then it is rejected. Um, you can see the chapter heading here. The chapter heading is called the nullity of repulsive and blameworthy innovations. The word that we usually refer to that by is bid'ah. Is bid'ah, and this is, it became the discussion around bid'ah. I think the discussions around it are lessening, but in preceding years there was tons and tons of discussion around bid'ah, people claiming certain actions are bid'ah, other people saying no, those actions aren't bid'ah, they're good. There's discussions around, is there such a thing as a good bid'ah? Are there no such thing as good bid'ah? Is everything that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do blameworthy and bad? Or are there things that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do that we can do as good deeds? All very important questions. Um, yeah. Does anybody have any specific questions on this topic before I just give my own explanation? Not my own explanation, but the explanation that I have taken from the understandings of the scholars. So I mean, has anybody come across somebody calling some action a bid'ah? Maybe it's just in my mind or in the circles that I am in.
No, Maulana, we've heard it saying
Definitely,
people
Maulana.
calling about Nafsi Shaban also.
Okay. Yeah, you'll find it everything. Somebody stands up, prays in the night of Laylatul Nisfu min Shahri Sha'ban, somebody will tell them that's bid'ah. Somebody does Mawlid, somebody will tell them that's bid'ah. Somebody stands for the salawat, somebody will tell them it's bid'ah. Somebody doesn't stand for the salawat, they'll tell them that's something else. Um, somebody will perform 20 rakats of Taraweeh, somebody will tell them that's bid'ah. Somebody will perform 8 rakats of Taraweeh, somebody else will tell them that's bid'ah. You hear the accusations leveled all over the place. Um, Sighting of the moon, not using the naked eye, some people will call that bid'ah. Um, and the examples of it abound. Firstly, what does bid'ah literally mean? The linguistic meaning of it, and then the technical meaning of it, right? Or the meaning of it as is applied in our Sharia. So a bid'ah literally means something that is brought about, an innovation, right? That's its literal meaning. As for its meaning within the house of Islam, people have different understandings of what constitute a bid'ah, right? There are those that take a very restrictive approach to it. And here, I'm not here to tell anybody what approach they must take. I'm here to explain different approaches so that we can understand and appreciate and live and let live, right? There are those that take a very restrictive understanding to the concept, and there are those that have a broader understanding to the concept of bid'ah. So, in terms of what to understand what a bid'ah is, in terms of Islam, you have to understand what a sunnah is, right? So, generally, the scholars of Islam, usuli scholars of Islam, those scholars that engage in Islamic legal theory, the process of how to derive rulings from the Quran and the Sunnah, they say that the Sunnah is whatever is attributed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, authentically, obviously, of actions, statements, or tacit approvals. ما أضيف إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من قول أو عمل أو تقرير. Anything attributed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam of speech, action, or tacit approval. The muhaddithin, the scholars of hadith, add to that, not for legislative purposes, but just for purposes of knowing the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they add to that أو وصف خلقي أو خلقي, any description of his physical person or his internal self, his of wasfin khalqi, any of his physical attributes or his character traits. Right? Now, if you listen to that definition very closely, you would have heard that it doesn't say anything about what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam doesn't do or didn't do. Right? Let me just say that again. Whatever is attributed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam of statements, actions, tacit approvals. Tacit approval is something, what is a tacit approval? Tacit approval is when somebody else does something in front of him and then he doesn't say anything, he doesn't rebuke it or rectify that person or anything. That also forms, we can say that that's a sunnah.
But
It
isn't
has
that
legislative
also
value.
part of not doing anything?
Right. So, yeah, I want to first point out to you that in mentioning this definition, we haven't said anything about the tark of Rasulullah. The tark means when Rasulullah doesn't do something. Right? So, how do we treat those things that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do? That's the question. That's the crux of how we now get from the discussion around Sunnah to the discussion around Bid'ah. How do we treat those things that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do? The first thing is we can't call it a Sunnah because it's not attributed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second thing is this: we ask ourselves the question, what does it pertain to? Does it pertain to mundane things about life? Or does it pertain simply to worldly things or trade and things like that? If it pertains to any of those matters, then by and large, the scholars will all agree you can do whatever new things you want to do over there, except you mustn't go beyond the bounds that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam clearly stated. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't drive a car. We drive cars, that's not a problem. Nobody considers that to be a bid'ah, right? In the technical sense of the word. Um, we eat waffles. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never ate waffles. Nobody considers that to be a bid'ah. Please don't pain my ears with anybody ever saying that. Nobody, so Rasulullah sallallahu never used a bank card. We use bank cards. And obviously, I'm assuming within a Sharia compliant way, nobody considers that to be a bid'ah. Um, we engage in various forms of investments and structures like that. Nobody considers those things to be bid'ah, as long as it doesn't go against the principles that are clearly stated by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like it doesn't have riba in it, etc. Right. The sticky point is when it comes to matters of worship, The sticky point is when it comes to matters of worship. Now, the question remains, is it that if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do something as an act of worship, then doing that thing is bad? That's the question that remains, right? If Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do a specific thing as an act of worship, then is it bad to do that thing? Is it punishable to do that thing, seeking thereby a reward for it or act as an act of worship? Yeah, this is where the scholars differ. So some scholars go the way of saying that, look, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says in some hadith, kullu bid'atin dalala. Every innovation is an act of worship. And so if it means every act, then or every innovation and it's pertaining to worship, then we take it as everything that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't do shouldn't be done. And then there are other scholars that say no, that kullu over there doesn't mean every single act of worship. And there's scholars that have written books on why that's the case. Number one, if it meant every, if it meant literally every, then driving the car and all of those things should be included in that because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't qualify the usage of bid'ah over there to acts of worship. Right? Um, so every should then be every, literally driving cars, eating waffles, all of those things should be categorized the same. So they say no. Another hadith, authentic hadith, narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, the hadith that's in front of us, it explains to us what is meant over there. So what does this hadith say? Man ahdatha fi amrina hada. Whoever brings about or innovates in this matter of ours, in Islam. So whoever brings an innovation in Islam, but then there's something else that it qualifies. Ma laysa minhu. He, he brings about in this religion what is not from it. فَهُوَ رَدْ. It is rejected. So they then say, well, if he brings about in this religion something that is from the religion, then it's not rejected. Listen to that again. The hadith says, whoever brings about in this matter of ours something that is not from it, that is rejected. So they then say, well, if the person brings about in this religion something that is from it, it's not rejected. And you see how that understanding is very valid? That's not the only proof that they have. They have many other proofs as well. But can you at least understand now from the reading of the hadith how people will take from this very rudimentary position that I've told you, and I haven't explained to you the tip of the iceberg of the depth of the discussion. But can you already see from this very beginning point how people can have different understandings from the same hadith, different respectable understandings? Right? One just understands the word kullu as every. Others say, well, that hadith is qualified by this hadith that says that only those things that are not from the religion are rejected. So what would an example of that be? Is dhikr something that's instituted in the Sharia? Of course, dhikr is something that's instituted in the Sharia. The Quran is replete with injunctions to make dhikr. Right? Does Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Sunnah give us certain adhkar to make? Yes, certainly. Does he say that you can't make remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with any other words? He doesn't say that at all. So can I um, then decide that, okay, we're going to get together once a week to make dhikr? They would say, well, the institution of dhikr is something that is part of Islam. The idea of mentioning Allah in a gathering is something mentioned in a hadith and praised in a hadith. Therefore, that action, it's not a new act of worship. Rather, it's something that's already from the religion, and thus it's not rejected. So go ahead, do it, as long as you're not contradicting any other laws any explicit statements or prohibitions from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in doing that. And they give examples. There's other proofs for that as well. Irshad, I see your hand. I'm going to take it in a moment. Um, the first, some examples of that would be that in the very lifetime of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were companions who did things as acts of worship without telling Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam about it, and they deemed it as good. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to find out about it, only after he came to find out about it, then he approved of it. And he didn't ever tell them that they shouldn't have done it without asking him first. I'll give you an example. Bilal radiallahu anhu, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says in a hadith, what is it that I hear the footsteps of Bilal in front of me in Jannah? Bilal radiallahu anhu tells him that whenever he performs wudu, he makes 2 rakat of salah. So we call that now tahiyatul wudu. And on account of that, his footsteps are heard in Jannah already while he's walking on the earth. But Bilal radiallahu anhu didn't go ask Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam if he could do that. He knew wudu is part of our deen. Salah is part of our deen. You can make nafil salah whenever you want to. It's part of our deen. So I'm going to make it my habit that every time after I perform wudu, I don't want that wudu to go to waste. So I'm going to perform 2 rak'at of nafil salah with that wudu. He didn't ask Rasulullah. He did it on his own. He believed it to be a good thing. He carried on doing it. Only after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam found out, then we can say he approved of it. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't tell him, Bilal, you shouldn't have done it without asking me. Because you were doing something there. You were doing a bidah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never did that. In the salah one day, they were performing salah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came up from ruku', Sami Allahu liman hamidah. The normal dhikr or the normal thing to say there would have been Sami Allahu liman hamidah, Rabbana lakal hamd. But then on one occasion, another companion added to that. He added to that. Hamdan, tayyiban, and all of those things, right? He added to that. After the salah, the companion, when doing that, he obviously deemed it to be something good. After the salah, Rasulullah asked, who said that thing? And then they were a bit quiet. And eventually Rasulullah informed him that like the angels thronged to take that dhikr up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To basically accept that, to record that dhikr. So what happened? Rasulullah, after the salah, Rasulullah approved of the action. But at the time that the companion did it, he was doing his own thing. He made that decision himself. He made that decision himself. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never told him that you shouldn't have done that without asking me first. So the group of scholars who take a more expansive approach, they say, well, here we have all of these examples of people that did things without the permission of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in acts of worship, right? But those acts of worship were part of this religion. They were based in this religion already. Right? The individual components of it were all part of this deen already, and therefore it's not rejected. And the fact that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't rebuke them for it shows that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam approved not only of the action, but of the method as well. Right? So he tacitly approved not only of the action, but of the method as well. And therefore, that's all fine. Then, on the other hand, you have those, a smaller minority of scholars who would say that no, still everything that Rasulullah didn't do shouldn't be done. And so we have these two approaches. Both of them justify the approaches from the Quran and the Sunnah. Both of them justify the approaches from the Quran and Sunnah. Different people have different temperaments and they will incline to different things. But both of them are respectable opinions that are taken from the Sunnah. And the scholars on both sides, on the one hand, we have Ash-Shatibi, rahimahullah ta'ala, who had a very strict stance against, these types of actions. But on the other hand, you have the entire tradition of the Shafi'i school, starting from Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, himself, up until the major commentators on Hadith, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, that categorized Izzuddin ibn Abdus Salam, all of these great, great scholars that categorized the concept of bid'ah. They say bid'ah, literally, it has no ruling. The literal meaning of bid'ah. As for the technical meaning of bid'ah, there are certain things that are literally termed bid'ah, but they're not necessarily technically called bid'ah. So you get certain things that Rasulullah didn't do, but they're still good actions. And then there's certain things that Rasulullah didn't do that are not good actions. For example, if somebody decides that they want to add an extra rak'ah onto Maghrib, that would be considered a bid'ah that everybody will agree is sinful. If a person wants to institute that another salah is compulsory, that would be considered bid'ah that is sinful. If somebody comes and they start an action, like even for example, Maulid, and then they give it a wrong ruling, they say that it's compulsory, then that would be considered a bid'ah that is reprehensible and blameworthy. But if they maintain it in its place, they recognize, well, this is not the sunnah that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. This is not an action that he did. All the components of it are taken from the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The form is not an act of worship. It's just something that we're doing for our culture or whatever. But the individual acts are part of the Sharia and we'll get rewarded for that. And we know that it's not a sunnah. The person that does it, good for him. The person that doesn't do it, good for him. He doesn't have to do it. He can do other good deeds as well. Then that's fine. Everything in its place, that's fine. So those are the two understandings that we have. Irshad, Bismillah.
Yeah, Mulana, just on this point that you've just made now, doesn't the danger come in if there is room to, lack of better terms, institute these kind of additional kind of acts of worship that do come from the Sunnah? But then the danger comes in the lay Muslim, the lay person, making it, thinking that these things that are part of culture and whatnot become part of the Sunnah. So, like for example, like the dua after Salah, like the communal dua, that isn't an instituted thing, but the fact that it happens everywhere, the average person might think that you have to make communal dua, and that then becomes problematic. So how do you get around that?
Right. So that's a brilliant point that you mentioned. Right. On account of communal practice, people get the wrong perception. So the way to get around that, even the scholars who say that there is scope for doing such things, they will say simply you remove that wrong perception by education. So generally, my teachers would say that if you make dua after salah, then on occasion, don't. So for me, at times, I'll make dua aloud after salah, and on occasion, I won't. Just so that people know that you don't have to do it aloud. I will continue to make my dua because that is an established sunnah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us in a hadith that that's a blessed time to make dua. It's a time of mustajab dua. So I'll make dua, but softly. Um, Even if somebody always, throughout his whole life, he makes dua loud after salah, but he just knows that he doesn't have to do it, or that it's not sunnah, as in the fact that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did it like that. And so the person that doesn't do it isn't wrong. He's also fine. As long as he doesn't attribute the wrong ruling to it. So my simple answer is to remove that wrong perception, you needn't write off the action. All that you need to do is rectify the perception, and that's done by education. Education on one hand, and occasionally omitting that at other times.
to keep going on this, I guess the counter argument or the counterpoint on this would then be that why add additional things to the sunnah when there is established things in the sunnah? Why, if there is things, good things to do, why not just follow that and not go down the slippery slope of doing these additional things, which may inherently be good, but may lead to people thinking that they're part of the sunnah? Just a counter argument.
Good. So what the proponents of these actions would do is say that, look, they're done for communal benefit. Right? They're done for communal benefit. They're done for sometimes. The question then is, why do cultures come about? So sometimes they're there for communal benefit. Sometimes they're there for community spirit. Sometimes they're there for, maintaining being in difficult circumstances. Sometimes they, there's various reasons for which it can be done. Sometimes there are things, and when I'm speaking about that, yeah, I'm more referring to something like, in my mind is something like that. But then there's other things that certain scholars will say are established via hadith or narrations, and others would disagree. Right? Maybe one group of scholars deem a narration to be authentic, and others don't. Then the one group may level the accusation against the other as that act that you're doing is bid'ah. However, in that regard, the discussion is more technical. I can give you an example of that. I'll give you an example. There's an authentic hadith in Tirmidhi, wherein the hadith is narrated by a companion by the name of Uthman ibn Hunayf. Right? It's an authentic hadith. Tirmidhi says the hadith is Hasan Sahih, if I remember correctly. And according to him, that's like the highest standard of authentic. A blind man comes to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he asks Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to make dua for him that his sight gets returned. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then tells him that, if he wants, he can make dua for him, or if he remains patient, then that will be better for him. The companion says, no, I want you to make dua for me. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then tells him to perform wudu like you would normally do, and then I can't remember, I think it's to make 2 rak'at or not, I'm not too sure about that. I'll have to check that hadith again. Right? But then he must make a dua. And in that dua, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells him that he must call upon Allah by saying, Allahumma, oh Allah, inni atawajjahu ilayka binabiyyika nabiyyir rahmah. I'm turning to you, O Allah, via your messenger, the messenger of mercy. Right? That's something that we call tawassul. That's something that we call tawassul. Right? Now you're getting into contentious stuff here, right? Tawassul. So who told the companion to do this thing? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told the companion to do it. Did he add any conditions to it? You can only do it now, right now. You can't do it tomorrow. He didn't add any clauses like that. Did Rasulullah say that it has to be while I'm alive? Rasulullah didn't say that at all. He didn't put down any of those conditions. He just said, make this dua. Right. Long afterwards, generally the scholars would permit that action, by and large accepted. But now a more restrictive group come along and they say, no, making tawassul even via Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is shirk, is bid'ah. So the first group, the guys who had that hadith in front of them, they will say, well, how can I be doing what Rasulullah said in a hadith and be doing bid'ah? Doesn't make sense. Then they say, no. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that to that companion, and it was only for while Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was alive, because the person has the ability, the living person has the ability to help. But then the first group will say to them, but the living person doesn't need the ability to help, because he's not asking the living person for their help. He's asking Allah, Allahumma inni atawajjahu ilayka. Oh Allah, I'm turning to you via the wasila of your messenger, the messenger of mercy. But I'm not asking the messenger of mercy. I'm asking Allah. So the only one that has to have the ability to help is Allah. And then the discussions will go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Right? The point that I'm making here is not that you or I in the year 2021, 1442, we will not do away with the khilaf that exists on the issue. But what we can do is we can understand all of the perspectives and then live and let live. And that is what I like to imbibe in people that are listening to me, or that's what I have also taken from my teachers, that we can't do away with every difference of opinion that exists, but we can understand different opinions and live and let live. Yaqeen, Bismillah.
I think maybe you're also thinking that there shouldn't be a point where Muslims split from each other, or they just, because of the differences, they don't want to,
Definitely,
be their brothers anymore, sisters anymore. Yeah.
definitely. However, that said, this all applies to matters in which there is a valid sphere of difference. There are other matters. You see, all that I was speaking about now was matters of action. When the bid'ah enters into matters of belief, then it becomes more serious. Right? When people start making up beliefs, then it starts becoming more serious. And in fact, when our scholars generally, the scholars of Islam, when they spoke about bid'ah, generally they were speaking about bid'ah in matters of belief, not bid'ah in action. And that's something important to note. So what I'm not saying is that every difference is admissible and it's okay. Right? But the decision as to whether something is a totally unacceptable innovation or not, that's not something that every individual can do. It's a very difficult and arduous process that scholars of this ummah will do, and those differences should remain amongst them. It's not for every person to get involved in. Because what happens then is people start labeling other people with terms that, were better left unsaid. And they do it without knowledge at that. I've seen people calling another person who's making maulid. This person is singing praises of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, something that the companions did in front of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Just because they love him, which is a fard part of our iman. And then people are calling him, he's going to the hellfire or whatever. How do you do that? You have some person that has a practice of making dhikr on a certain day, uh, not because they believe it has to be like that, just because it's convenient, right? And it's culturally convenient. They make dhikr on a specific day. They're literally remembering Allah. They're crying when they make dua to Allah, all of these things. Then you have other people that say, oh, for that action, you're going to the hellfire. Come on. We must give everything must be put in its perspective, in its place. We must understand where our boundaries are, and we must understand how to deal with difference. And inshallah, that will pave the way to a stronger ummah. Not just a stronger ummah, it will also help us to curb our own nafs, because the nafs is like that. The nafs, it likes to get one over other nufus. It likes to get one over other people. It likes to be right and everybody else be wrong. Right? But when we broaden our horizons and our understanding, then we see that at times there may be another perspective, and I have to keep my nafs in check here on this. Sunir, your hand is up.
You can just give an example of a bid'ah in belief, because you spoke about the action and you said the one is the more serious one is belief.
Okay, bid'ah in belief. An example of bid'ah in belief would be something like the ideas of the Khawarij, like where they would believe that if a person just does a major sin, then they're automatically a kafir. That's a belief. So that would be a bid'ah in belief. Another bid'ah in belief would be something held by the maybe by the Mu'tazila, the over rationalists, the ones who would say that Allah's compelled to make certain things, to legislate in certain ways, or um, the Shia would have certain bid'ah in beliefs. Um, so all of those various uh, you know groupings that have different beliefs in Islam, they generally have some kind of bid'ah in belief.
Okay, shukran. So it's almost like you get now these some scholars or so that will say that certain actions, okay, now you're a kafir. So is it that type of scenario?
Um, it's hard to give a statement just based on what you're saying there, because it
I'm
could be.
referring to, like, like you get the majlis and they will come up and say, okay, if you follow this scholar, then you kafir, and you do this, then you kafir.
Yeah, okay, that's not a bid'ah, that's just insanity. Yeah, that's not really a bid'ah, because he, many of his opinions are not actually based in anything solid. So it's like hard to even call it a bid'ah, because no grouping actually subscribes to that. It's just him. But you see, I think that's going a bit deeper now, because now what we're trying to tie in the idea of bid'ah into takfir, so two like slightly different things. So inshallah, I don't want to just make that connection just like that. Oh yeah, Rasim Wallah Khalil is
Sheikh,
with us.
could we please view the English translation of the hadith?
Mhm. It is related that the mother. I think it should be on the screen now. Yeah. Okay. Mullah Khalil is here, and the first is waiting for me, so I'm gonna have to leave and go. If we have any more questions on this next week, inshallah, we can look at that. Ziad had a question here. How do we reconcile when and if the decision or innovation leads to matters of sunnah worship or even fard worship? Example, 8 verse 20 rakat, or which day the first of Ramadan starts due to the moon. Okay, Ziad, please keep that question for next week, inshallah. We can pick up over there and then take it from there. But we're in for now. وجزاكم الله خيرا وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. مولانا Khalil, sorry for going over time. I'm gonna make you the host. These guys get me into. Yeah, I can't say they got me into the discussion. I got into it myself. Well, I think you already did those. Yeah. Nice one.